I'm here with Dr. Hernan Cuervo, Associate Professor in Education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Thank you very much, Hernan, for giving me the time for this interview. Given your expertise and experience in research and practices relating to rural education, I would like to ask you what makes rurality an important topic for research and discussion in education?
Well, to begin with, in education, rurality is an important topic because it's often not discussed. Hence, it lies very much at the margins of the mainstream of education. One of the problems of education research is that much of what passes by education research is really urban education. So it's important to study those that are most marginalized and disadvantaged in society. With this, I'm not meaning that rural people are disadvantaged and marginalized per se, but the research in rurality within the education field is pretty much marginalized against urban education or what it goes as mainstream education. Another problem that makes rural education or rurality per se worth study is not just a significant proportion of the population live in rural spaces, or much of the food that we consume in urban metropolis is produced in rural spaces, but it's the issue that also much of what passes as rural education or rural studies of young people is not really about rurality, but it's really just the setting is in a rural place, but the research is really about education or youth. Hence, there's a need to take a rural lens to study education problems that take into account the context of place, space, community, people, and so forth.
And can you also share with us some of the insights from your own research and work in the area of rural education?
One of my interests is a theory of justice, and I wanted to examine the idea of justice for people living in rural communities and teaching, learning, working in rural schools. One of the things that I have understood is that distributive justice, the dimension of distributive justice within the theory of justice, has a great weight in rural schools. And this is because for most part of history in Australia and in other countries, rural schools or rural education has been lagging behind material resources or the allocation of distribution of proper goods. Second, there's a problem that in metropolis or in urban places you have access to many issues, resources, services that promote social capital, cultural capital, and so forth. For example, a teacher can easily in a city take the students for a journey to the museum, to the aquarium, and so forth. In rural places, this becomes more difficult. Perhaps you have a greater contact with nature, and if that is your field of research or science or teaching, you can engage with that. But coming back to my research, so I was interested in looking how the theory of justice or the idea of justice is understood in school. And contrary to the idea that there is just a predominant view on distributive justice, I found that other dimensions like recognition and association, or also known as participation, were as important. And this was particularly for teachers who are working in the mix of policies that promote and encourage managerialism, performativity, the sort of audit culture that we have heard of or read for the last 15, 10, 20 years. The idea that teachers, there's a set of indicators by which teachers are examined, and at the same time there's a set of indicator or assessment by which teachers examine students, which then gets publicized in websites or in league tables, and where comparisons are made of who is going well, who is lagging behind, who can be rewarded and who should be punished. This pressure on teachers makes them appreciate other sides of justice beyond distribution. For example, the idea of what is the subjectivity, the identity of the teacher. What is that I am as a teacher? Just a person that prepares a student for assessments, or an educator that has to broaden the idea of what it means to learn and create a rounded student. It doesn't mean that assessment don't need to occur. That is not the point. But if that is just the only purpose in education, there is something missing. And hence, what I have found that even in places like rural schools that might be needing more resources than your very well-resourced urban school, given that not all urban schools are so well-resourced, I did find teachers talking about this idea of recognition of their profession and subjectivity, and the idea of greater participation, them having a greater say in the issues that affect their work and their life.
The other question I want to ask you is, what are some of the emerging areas in research and policy in education in relation to rural education?
This year, in 2018, we have had a new government report around rural education. It's called Independent Review on Regional, Rural and Remote Education. Not surprisingly, the report conducted by Professor John Halsey has found many of the issues that have been found 20 years ago almost by the Human Rights Education, but the Human Rights Equal Opportunity Commission. That's the right title of that commission, which in the year 1999 and 2000, in my view, conducted and developed the most important rural education piece of policy or research and policy. And some of the issues emerging from the Human Rights Equal Opportunity Commission and from the last report from this year, 2018, is that the more rural you go in some areas, the greater the problems in schools and in education. For example, the more rural you go, the harder it is to staff your school. The more rural you go, the more perhaps you need greater information technology, ICT, in order to bridge the gap that space, place, land creates. The more rural you go, the less likely a student will make it to higher education. The more rural you go, other kind of educational outcomes decrease or are not so good as in metropolitan areas. Of course, there are schools in rural places that are thriving, the same in urban places, and some schools in urban places that are struggling, the same in rural places. But I think the agenda, unfortunately, through the things that I have just said, staffing of schools, proper distribution of resources, making sure that rural students have the same chances to go to university, TAFE, or whatever pathway after school they want to continue. Those kind of issues, 20 years after, as I said, the most important policy report, they're still there. And that, I think, is a worry for the government and for society in itself.
And what role do you think teachers can play in addressing some of the inequities that you mentioned that arise from issues such as rurality and living in regional areas?
In the previous question, I mentioned that staff in rural schools continue to be a major issue for rural and particularly remote schools. Hence, teachers in rural and remote places become carriers of the cultural capital that some institutions tend to value, such as by institutions I mean such as universities, workplaces, or other kind of institutions and organizations that provide pathways of activities for young people and for adults for that matter too. So the role of teachers in rural and remote schools is significant, it's very important, because in many instances, in many small towns, teachers might be one of the few professionals in the community. You might not have, as in big regional towns or in urban centers, a plethora of psychologists, of counselors, of career counselors, of doctors, and so forth. Some communities that I have studied with 300 people living in the town, their teacher is perhaps the only professional. Hence, that teacher carries a very strong responsibility, a very strong reputation, and also carry much of that capital that, as I said before, is value in schools. and in other institutions like higher education, works, places, and so forth. Having said this, I want to provide a caveat that I think it is wrong to deposit just on teachers and school the full responsibility, A, for educating students, B, for transforming society or producing social change. That will be foolish to depend just on teachers, but also will be asking them too much. Teachers can teach and should teach, but I'm not sure if teachers can be psychologists, doctors, counselors, and so forth. There's so much that teachers can do. So hence, school, community, society, and government, the state, need to support teachers and need to support those communities to make sure that all the responsibility of educating and preparing young people for life doesn't just lie on the few teachers that teach in that school and community.
My last question is, what would be a piece of advice that you give to a teacher who is entering the profession and who will be working in a school either in a regional or rural area?
Recently, I published a journal article in the Asia Pacific Journal of Teacher Education with my colleague Dr. Daniela Cuervo here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. We basically track some teacher candidates from this graduate school that took rural placements, and we found some very important and interesting things. The first thing that we found is that those that came from a rural place or had an attachment to rural places were the most likely to try to, after their studies, get a job in a rural schools, while the other participants in the research that were coming from an urban place took the rural placement as a way of training, as one of them said, as a boot camp, as a way of, if I can make it in what supposedly is a tougher environment as rural schools, which in some cases is, and in some cases it is not. If I can make it in rural places, then I can come back to the city and make it in urban schools. This is a problem in the sense that we are perhaps sending teacher candidates or recent graduate teachers into rural places when their main goal is really not to stay in that community. And hence we are contributing to the high turnover of teachers in rural schools. I think it is important to identify those pre-service teachers that are prepared to make a career in a rural place. This doesn't mean asking them to commit 20 years of their life, of course not, but at least that they have a very strong attachment, root, or idea of teaching in a rural place. Having said this, many new teachers that go to rural places find themselves in the perennial problems of isolation, not being aware or used to live in a small community, find themselves in the problem of the fishbowl. That is the idea that, you are too exposed to the rest of the community because there are fewer members of the community and the school community, and hence every action that you take within the school and outside the school hours is magnified, contrary to what might happen in a big place like Melbourne. So for pre-service teachers or teacher candidates that are going to take a rural placement, or for new teachers going to rural schools, I will first advise that they make sure they know the community they're going, they make sure that they have visited the school, spend some weeks, make a new kind of a contact there with a mentor, have a support group, and that they really know the step that they're doing or taking towards working in rural schools, because sometimes the challenges and the pressures are a little bit higher than in urban schools. Having said this, many pre-service teachers or teacher candidates that have gone to rural schools have also enjoyed very much in the sense of the greater sense of community. They have talked very much about how kids really have a greater affection and attachment to teachers, and how things become more harmonious, or there's certain more immediate rewards in the kind of services and the kind of work you put into the community. So that's a plus. But you need to make sure that you know what you're getting into when you go to a rural place, in the many things that are different to an urban school or living in an urban community.
Thank you very much, Hernan. It has been a great pleasure talking to you.